The COVID-19 pandemic has changed the way we live, affecting our health and well-being.
I feel like I'm trapped within my own mind. No one can hear me. I feel like no one knows who I am. I don't like this feeling.
Kids and adolescents face a situation that is unparalleled. It's My Talk today features Dr. Liesl Windsor, developmental pediatrician, who will provide us with some insight into how COVID-19 is affecting our children. Dr. Windsor will introduce herself.
Hi, Dr. Rizzolo. Thanks so much for having me. As you mentioned, I'm a developmental and behavioral pediatrician, which means that I work with children who have developmental, behavioral, and learning challenges, but also kids who have anxiety and depression. And so I'm really happy to be here.
We're glad to have you here. Dr. Windsor, welcome again to It's My Talk. Will it be true to say that under normal circumstances, adolescence is a time when students deal with a lot of psychological and social issues, which may come with a certain level of stress?
Oh, absolutely. Even prior to the pandemic, adolescence has always notoriously been a challenging period for children and their parents. If you think about it, as a child transitions from childhood to adolescence and then eventually adulthood, that comes with changes in their bodies, changes in their social relationships, both at home and at school, and just kind of figuring out who they are. And so adolescence in and of itself is definitely a stressful time for children.
I agree. And Dr. Windsor, based on your clinical observations, has there been an increase in the level of stress in adolescents and early teens during the pandemic? And are these stressors that they face different to the pre-pandemic stressors? What are some of the issues they face?
Yeah, this is a really, really timely question. Studies have shown that the rates of anxiety, depression, and suicidality in adolescents and children in general, those rates have increased over the past year and a half, and that has certainly coincided with the timing of the pandemic. And so we're seeing more children with anxiety and depression related to having challenges with coping during a challenging time. And this is in addition to the baseline stress that we just discussed that comes with becoming an adolescent and being an adolescent. Some of the main things that we've seen as stressors, they often have to do with social distancing. And so when you think about it, adolescents, they look to their peer groups, they look to their family members and community members for support. And this is definitely one of the methods of becoming more resilient. And they just can't do that anymore. Thinking about celebrations, graduations, promotions, these are things that they're not able to engage in the way that they had in the past. But also when we think about grieving and being able to attend services for loved ones, they're also not able to do that. And those, challenges with celebrations and with grieving definitely negatively impact mental health for our adolescents. And that's additional stress that we didn't necessarily have prior to the pandemic.
I agree, Dr. Windsor, because it seems to me that the ability to grieve has a cathartic effect and a healing effect for kids, and not being able to do that. This is really a stress on kids.
They definitely, there is a therapeutic process that takes place when a child is able to say goodbye to a loved one. There's a certain degree of closure that comes with being able to say goodbye to a loved one. And it sometimes helps with processing, the death itself and that loss. And so, families have had to find other ways to help their children grieve, because the typical, gatherings are no longer allowed. And as you can imagine, if grieving in a way that is culturally appropriate and acceptable is no longer culturally appropriate and acceptable, then these children don't have that catharsis and that ability to get closure in the way that they would have in the past.
So then I want to ask the question, what about kids who already have mental disorders? I mean, you might see some of them in your office.
Yeah, so I've seen a range of different responses to the pandemic for children who have baseline mental health disorders. Definitely, the majority of them are having more struggles in terms of not having their peer group to talk to face, not having, the opportunity to go out and exercise, not being able to engage in activities that they would have found pleasurable and, distracting. And for other children who might have social anxiety, for example, for them, the pandemic has actually been a way of escape because they're being allowed to stay at home and not necessarily engage socially. And that would have been the thing that would have been anxiety provoking for them. But the final way that we've seen these children really suffer is in fear about the virus itself, right? So fear about what they're seeing on the internet, fear about what they're hearing from their friends, fear about their family members contracting COVID-19. And that has definitely escalated some of the baseline anxiety some of these kids are experiencing.
So would it then be true to say that some of the stress is related to the information they hear and cannot properly process or understand?
Absolutely. So, with the rise of social media and, just the internet in general, our kids are being bombarded with a flood of information that they don't necessarily know how to filter. And so, the information itself may not be a bad thing, but then there's also misinformation, right? And then how does a child differentiate between the two? And so this is where parents and family members, guardians, have a real pivotal role in figuring out what does your child need to know and how to have those open conversations with them in a way that they can understand.
Dr. Windsor, I was thinking, for me myself, I turn off the news sometimes because it's too much. But for these kids, 13 to 17 years old, they may not have the mechanisms to deal with what they have to face. What measures can the adults in their life, parents, guidance counselors, and so on, and even developmental psychologists like yourself, take to help these children to deal with these anxieties?
Well, I'll say that in my experience, the single most effective way for these children to cope and be resilient has to do with being surrounded by a network, right? So that network can include family, it can include friends, it can include guidance counselors, coaches, it can include church members. These children really just need to be surrounded by love and reassurance, and they need to be able to understand that the adults around them are prioritizing them and that they're open to having conversations. So, taking off the news, I think that that's a really, really good way to just shut things down, but also having the conversations because these children do need to know what's happening because, lack of information completely is also going to be very anxiety provoking. So number one would be maintaining those connections to this child support network. So whether it's through, WhatsApp or through FaceTime or Zoom, being intentional about creating those relationships creating and maintaining those relationships is going to be extremely pivotal during this time. The other thing I would mention is that this is a great time for families to bond with each other. So in some places, our kids are not yet able to meet with each other, but families can work on things like family game nights, preparing meals, planning meals, looking at what your child's gifts and skills might be, or what gifts and skills they want to learn, whether it might be autistic, creative, culinary. So figuring out very innovative ways of bringing out your child's skills, I think is another way to help them pivot from focusing on what seems to be a very negative time to some more positive activities.
Very instructional. So I would call those things sort of like distracting activities, that the kids need.
Yeah.
But I think too that some of the children, some of the adolescents, young teens would crave a space to share their concern and, obtain guidance through healthy discussion. And I must praise the Department of Education in New York City, which allows kids to have what they call social emotional learning time, where they can find things, times to do this, an opportunity for doing this. Because I think that emotional support at this time could act as a buffer.
Absolutely.
So any final thoughts, Dr. Windsor?
Thank you again for having me. I think these are really important discussions to have. And for some families, they don't know where to begin. And it feels like things are constantly changing. For most of our kids, the things that we talked about in terms of emotional support from the family members and the school, but there is a subset of children who are experiencing significantly more distress in the midst of the pandemic. These are kids who we're finding becoming more withdrawn, more irritable, their sleeping patterns and their eating habits might change. They may not enjoy things that they used to enjoy anymore. And these are kids that I worry about in terms of there may be something more serious going on and they may need more medical support and therapeutic support. And so for the parents who might have children who they're seeing these behavioral and emotional changes that seem to be excessive, I encourage those parents to reach out to their mental health providers or their pediatricians who can help them figure out next steps for either medical or therapeutic treatment.
And that's where experts like you come in, Dr. Windsor. Thank you for being with us. And this has been a very enriching experience. Your insights have really provided understandings as to what the kids are going through in this pandemic. And you have provided valuable information for parents and adults to support these kids during this time.
When this is all done, the world will be better and maybe more fun.
This is Ingrid Zolo, and it has been my talk.